Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, a former diplomat talks about what he believes is a greater crisis than the threat of nuclear war was with the Soviet Union. A conversation with Strobe Talbott about climate change and why he's not afraid to talk about global governance to help solve the world's problems. That's next on Dialogue. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. From an early age, my guest today excelled in life. When Strobe Talbott was an undergraduate at Yale, he ran the newspaper. Fluent in Russian, Talbott won a Rhodes Scholarship to study in Oxford. He then went on to work as a journalist for Time magazine for more than 20 years, specializing in writing about Soviet-American relations. He also headed up Time's Washington bureau and was a foreign affairs columnist. When Bill Clinton, who had known Talbott at Oxford, became president, he asked him to serve in the State Department. There he was a special advisor to the Secretary of State on the new independent states of the former Soviet Union, and then Deputy Secretary of State. In 2002, Talbott became the president of the Brookings Institution, a think tank in Washington, D.C. He's the author of 12 books, many of them on diplomatic issues and Russia. His latest book, though, Fast Forward, examines what he considers the world's greatest crisis, global warming. I spoke with Mr. Talbott about this and other issues at the Sun Valley Writers Conference. Since 1995, the conference has brought well-known and insightful writers to Idaho to discuss their works and current events. I started by asking Mr. Talbott why he's devoting so much of his time to the climate change issue. With everything else that's been written about this issue, why did you want to add your voice and a sense of urgency to it?
Because nowhere near enough is being done about it. There's a lot of talk, but I actually think there should be both more talk and more rational talk about it. This is unlike anything we've ever had to deal with. It doesn't perhaps threaten the extinction of our species. My guess is we as a species, even if worse comes to worse, will in some sense survive. But it definitely threatens the human enterprise as we now know it. And it requires near-term action by the United States of America. And our government is kind of dead in the water on the issue.
We'll talk about the government in just a second, but what about the people, the popular opinion? For a while it seemed like this was really on people's radar screens. Public opinion was turning. Then there were these series of emails that came out from some of the scientists involved. And I don't know the latest polling, but people are back to being very skeptical about climate change, or at least it's not, the sense of urgency is not there. It's a tragedy within the tragedy. By the way, I think the term ClimateGate is an absurdity. It wasn't anything like, a Watergate or Iran-Contra gate or something like that. But there were some unfortunate leaks of some unfortunate emails, particularly out of the University of East Anglia in the UK, that called into question the objectivity of some of the scientists involved in the UN process. The UN process, which has been going on for more than 20 years, has a pretty good track record, actually, of maintaining accuracy, objectivity, scientific integrity, but there were some slips around the edges, and unfortunately they were publicized right about the time of the Copenhagen summit, which meant that the world attention was on that issue. The summit wasn't going very well, and it just played into the hands of the deniers and the skeptics, and I would say the demagogues. Well, and without public support, Congress isn't as likely to push for something as, say, maybe an immigration bill or health care reform bill. And as we speak, the climate bill that was in Congress is pretty much essentially dead for now. Is there somebody you blame for that, or? I think blame storming is probably not a very useful activity. There's plenty of blame to go around. There's also some credit due to some members of Congress, and I would say to the President of the United States, for trying to keep the thing alive. But as you say, it is at best kind of on artificial life support, and we'll just have to see how our politics play out over the next period. It's going to require, however, bipartisan support. That almost goes without saying, in part because there are Democrats
who come from and represent areas of the country that are heavily dependent on coal, who, no matter what their personal convictions might be, just will feel for reasons of political survival they can't support it. So that's going to, no matter what the composition, even if there were to be in one house or the other a Democratic majority, it's going to require Republican participation. And there are some Republicans, like Lindsey Graham, a senator from South Carolina, who in a less partisan, less polarized atmosphere might be prepared to help on this.
Nuclear power is back in people's minds as a potential way to work with the climate change issue. Do you worry that at the same time it brings up security issues?
It does bring up security issues. I still think that a nuclear renaissance, that's the phrase that's used for a return to more reliance on nuclear generated electricity for civilian purposes, obviously. I think we need to throw every single means we can at the problem of, or the challenge of weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels and getting to a low carbon and ultimately a no carbon economy. Nuclear power should be one of those. However, going to your point, it is essential that if we are going to have a nuclear renaissance, it be accompanied by a much, much more effective nuclear nonproliferation regime.
If we could divert a little bit and talk about another aspect of U.S.-Russia policy, the spies that were apprehended.
You know, every now and then in the very serious world that I inhabit and work in, we get some comic relief. I really regarded that whole episode as laughable. Among other things, you know, we call them spies. Yes, they were spies, but they were so incompetent as spies that it was difficult for our federal authorities to charge them with espionage, because, you know, here they were, deep penetration agents and all that, but they were sort of like the spy world equivalent of Keystone Cops, and it was one of the consequences was a major embarrassment for the Russian intelligence services. I've been hanging out in that part of the world a long time. I know a lot of people from the old Soviet intelligence who were just, you know, deeply shamed that their tradecraft had fallen to such a low level. It's not a big deal. Neither country is making a big deal out of it.
You said you hung out with a lot of those people. You've recently, there was a book written by a former Washington Post reporter, and he interviewed an ex-agent for the Russia who alleged that you were somebody that they could go to get information easily, and you have said that that is not true.
Well, in a sense, of course, it was true.
Because you were having conversations all the
Yeah,
time.
right. I mean, my job for 8 years when I was in the State Department during the Clinton administration was to work constantly, intensively, and often very candidly with my Russian counterparts. One in particular, who was essentially my counterpart in the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Deputy Minister of Defense, and yes, of course they would come to me to get information, and I was in the business of making sure that they understood what American policy was, what our objectives were. It was kind of a laughable accusation. Misunderstood the very function of diplomacy. Obviously, another important function of diplomacy is to, in fact, the number one function of diplomacy is to advance American interests, and all of the conversations that I had with my Russian counterparts were to that purpose.
When you look back on your time in the administration and in the State Department, are there regrets that you have? I know you've written some about this.
Sure, of course. Governments are a little bit like individual human beings. And there's a kind of collective sense among those of us who were made up a team that was working with and for President Clinton in the 1990s that, you know, there's some things we were proud of, quite a number of things we were proud of. There are other things we have regrets about. In some cases, the regrets are, again, like those we have as individuals. They aren't so much, they're not so much a matter of guilt. Oh, if only I had done this, or if I had seen that. It's more, oh, if only luck hadn't been better, if only circumstances hadn't. But there are other places where we simply saw we should have been paying more attention to that. Rwanda being a perfect example. I have some regrets about Russia. I wish we had used our influence and our resources better and earlier to help head off the degree of corruption that accompanied the opening up of the former Soviet Union. But I firmly believe that not only if Al Gore had been elected president or assumed the presidency after the 2000 election, or if John McCain had been the Republican candidate and had been the president after 2000, I am quite certain that when 9/11 came along, President Gore or President McCain would have concentrated on attacking the attackers, dealing with the country, or I might even say the non-country, the failed state, from which the 9/11 terrorists came. That would have been job one until it was finished.
Meaning Afghanistan.
Yes, meaning Afghanistan and the border areas of Pakistan, as we now know. What President Bush did, that I think was a strategic error and folly of very long consequence, was to, in effect, use 9/11, Afghanistan's culpability, or the Taliban's culpability for 9/11, as a pivot to go after what President Bush was quite obsessed about, and that was getting rid of Saddam Hussein. So we missed a chance in late 2001, 2002, 2003 to really deal with the Afghan problem. And we diverted resources and political will to Iraq, and we're living with the consequences of that in both countries today.
If Al Gore had, as you phrase it, assumed the presidency, would climate change
Yes.
been more on the docket?
You bet. President Bush, particularly during his first term and into his second term, didn't take the issue seriously. We all know that Al Gore sure did, and I think would have given it quite a bit of priority. Now, to the credit of President Bush, towards the end of his term, he did begin to take the issue more seriously, and it was he who set up the G20, which is dealing with the issue to some extent. He convened what was then called the Major Emitters Summit, now called the Major Economies Summit, but it was late. And urgency is one of the principal factors we have to recognize on the issue of climate change.
When I've read through some of your books, what comes across is the incredible patience it takes to be a negotiator, to be a diplomat, to work with countries that have different customs and cultures than we do in terms of getting things done, different timelines. Is that something that you were just naturally born with, or because in reporting it's all deadline oriented, it's very quick, and you made the transition from being in reporting and getting the story quick to these long talks?
Well, it's a very astute question, and I've thought a lot about it, because when I was transformed overnight from a journalist into a diplomat, I felt a little bit like, Chevy Chase or Dan Aykroyd in one of these, or Bill Murray in an out-of-body movie. All of a sudden I wake up one day and I'm no longer a reporter and I'm a diplomat. And my first reaction was, oh my God, I'm not prepared for this. In fact, journalism had prepared me in a number of ways. And one was that it had taught me to listen carefully to other people and to understand positions before I took a position on them, which I think is an important part of being a diplomat.
One book that you wrote called The Great Experiment is subtitled in part, The Quest for a Global Nation. Now, the phrase global governance or one world government is very scary to some people. In fact, as you mentioned in your book, it's seen as so politically toxic that some euphemisms have grown up around it so that people don't say world governance. You're not afraid to use that in your title, and you look back as far as Einstein and say there's lots of other people who have argued for world governance. Why is it so scary to people?
Well, let's break the issue into two parts. First of all, there is a difference, which I make very clearly in The Great Experiment, between global governance and what that phrase means and world government. I not only believe in global governance, we have global governance. It is a fact of life. When you get on an airplane and fly from whatever, Chicago or Boise to Chicago to someplace abroad, you are a beneficiary of global governance, because we have international treaties that govern air travel and the movement of money, and there are many United Nations agencies. We've had global governance for a long time. Global governance simply means that governance takes place at every level, from a neighborhood to award in Washington, D.C. to the city, to the state, the county, the nation, which of course is still the principal building block of the world, the nation state. But then you have regional governance and then you have global governance. So it's simply a matter of making global governance more effective in a way that advances the interests of individual states. That shouldn't be terribly controversial. But the phrase, as you say, resonates in some people's minds with world government. That that the United Nations runs the world and that the sovereignty of all individual states is subsumed by a world government in, God knows, in Geneva or someplace like that. That is not what I am either advocating or predicting. May happen a century from now, who knows, but it's not going to happen in the time frame that we need to worry about, either as advocates or as people who are afraid of it.
You're also on the executive committee of part of the Trilateral Commission. If you go to certain rallies around the country, you will see signs mentioning the Trilateral as, again, kind of a hydra-headed monster that
Right.
is aimed at one world government. It was formed by Mr. Rockefeller in the 1970s, has hundreds of heads of state and other thinkers on it. How do you respond to the fear people have about the Trilateral Commission?
Well, I guess I should be respectful and of that point of view, but I'm kind of mystified by it. I have sort of a double jeopardy because I'm also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is sometimes linked with the Trilateral Commission as some kind of elitist cabal either running the world secretly or trying to take over the world. I think anybody who has any objective understanding of how the world works wouldn't spend a lot of time worrying about that.
But people do, and if you Google the Trilateral Commission, your site that doesn't come up, what comes up are all the conspiracy sites.
No, I spend a lot of time in the presence of Professor Google looking at the screen and have reason to go to those, not to those sites, but to those topics, and I am struck by it. It's a bit of a mystery to me, to be honest.
People are worried about losing, maybe in this sense, American hegemony. They're worried.
Well, we've already lost American hegemony, and there's some question about the extent to which hegemony, of course, means the total predominance of the world, that we run the world. And I think that's actually an illusion that we should lose. We are the most powerful state, not only in the world, but in history. We have more than the potential. I think we have a very good chance of remaining the single most powerful state on earth for a long time to come. But that's different from saying that we are the boss of the world. I think there is an important difference for people to understand between being a leader, which we are and we should be proud of being, and being a boss. But being a leader means that other countries are prepared to follow us. Now, on the question of this hypersensitivity in the United States over our independence and our sovereignty, I understand that and I support it. Our country was born in the late 18th century with something called a Declaration of Independence, breaking free of an empire. We take our independence very seriously, and we should. And I have never believed in any political objective or movement that would compromise our independence in a way that would put us under the influence of some other state. However, there's another word that I think people need to understand and have part of their vocabulary for comprehending the world we live in, and that's interdependence. Absolute sovereignty is an illusion. Our borders are porous, as we are being reminded all the time. Money can move around the world in an unmoderated way. Pathogens, germs move around the world. We are dependent. Weather, climate doesn't respect national boundaries. So what happens in other parts of the world influences our lives. What happens in this country affects people in other parts of the world. And going back to global governance is in large part an effort to regulate, to manage, and to make safe the way in which interdependence works and globalization works.
You are also in charge of Brookings, which is an oft-quoted institution. Some call it left-leaning, others centrist.
We call it independent.
You call it independent.
Right.
And so where did it get the left-leaning moniker then?
Well, it's had a reputation over the years that has shifted. We've been around for almost 100 years. Back in the 1950s, we were sometimes considered to be conservative. That was in part because some of our scholars were more critical of the policies of the Truman administration. In the 1960s, quite a number of the economists who contributed to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society came out of the Brookings Institution. Today, we have a number of our former scholars who are serving in the Obama administration, but we also have a number of people who have been associated with past Republican administrations, including that of George W. Bush, working with us. The word we use, Marcia, is nonpartisan rather than bipartisan. There's an interesting difference, at least what I think is an interesting difference. Bipartisan suggests that truth and wisdom reside either in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Our view is, not necessarily. Good ideas, sound ideas that can be incorporated into how we govern ourselves, which is what Brookings is all about, often come from outside either of the parties and their ideologies and their programs. And for us, nonpartisanship and independence aren't a matter of how you happen to vote on election day. It's whether you are open-minded enough to see that really good discussion produces really good ideas, and really good discussion involves civility of discourse, listening to the other person, and looking for ways to find common ground.
You have an offshoot called Brookings Mountain West.
We do, and we're very proud of it.
Located in Las Vegas.
Right. This is a part of the country that represents some bad news that we have to deal with and some good news that we have to encourage. The bad news is largely economic and also environmental. Las Vegas in particular has been just clobbered by the collapse of the housing market, not to mention the economy as a whole, presenting its leaders, its political leaders and its citizens with some problems that we think we at Brookings can help address. But the other thing that's going on is that there is more cooperation among cities and communities within the Intermountain West region, and that is, we think, a model for the way this country is increasingly going to govern itself. Yes, the federal government will continue to be important. Yes, city halls and state government, state houses will continue to be important, but increasingly we're becoming what Bruce Katz calls a metro nation. And the Intermountain West region is an important metro area which we would like to put a spotlight on and have other parts of the country understand better what's going on here.
You mentioned good news, bad news. As we wrap up, taking a long-range view from your profession as a journalist, as a scholar, as a diplomat, how are you feeling about the era in which we are living right now?
I'm a inveterate optimist. I think that optimism is not only good for one's enjoyment of life, but it also has an operational value. If more of us were optimists, and we acted as though there is hope, there are solutions to the problems, it is more likely that we would find solutions to the problem. That's the first point. That said, my optimism is in a kind of delicate balance with my concern, particularly about the issue we talked about at the outset, which is climate change. I'm 64 years old. I'm not going to be around in 2050, which is some kind of moment of truth looming out there in the future on whether we're going to have a livable planet and ecosphere. But I've got a 3-year-old granddaughter and a 1-year-old grandson. My 1-year-old grandson will be 41 years old in 2050, and I really care about how he and his sister live and what kind of opportunities they have. And one of the poignancies and urgencies of the current moment is that your generation, my generation, same generation, is the first generation really to know that we do live in an era when, for man-made reasons, the climate is changing in potentially dangerous ways, and we're the last generation that can really do something about it. That puts a huge responsibility on us, which is why I think all of us, whatever political perspective we have, whether we're coming at it from the standpoint of a faith-based community or from government, or in my case from a think tank, or in your case from the media. We need to do everything we can to elevate public understanding of the stakes here, and to have some leadership from below, if I can say that. We cannot just look to our leaders in Washington to do something about this. We've got to get our society more involved.
And I know you've said that this is potentially more intractable than what we were dealing with in the Cold War era, where the leaders of U.S. and Russia just had to do nothing
Exactly.
to make sure that we were okay. Just don't press the button.
Yeah, just wake up, you know, Mr. President in the White House, Mr. General Secretary in the Kremlin, just when you wake up tomorrow morning, make sure you don't hit the button and start World War III. And for 40 years, that worked, and well, let's hope it continues to work. Climate change is different. The metaphor that Bill Antholis and I use in the book is the difference between the sword of Damocles, which is what the nuclear threat was, and as long as we didn't reach up there and snip the thread, the sword wouldn't come down on our necks. Climate change is more like slow slicing, or death by 1,000 cuts, which is a Chinese method of torture and execution. We've been slow slicing ourselves since the Industrial Revolution. We've been bleeding. Now, we haven't felt the pain to the extent that we feel we're being tortured, and we haven't faced up to the prospect of execution, so we haven't stopped doing it. But that's what we have to do. It's not just a matter of restraining ourselves from doing something stupid. It's a matter of stopping doing something stupid, which is pumping gigatons, billions of tons of carbon into the air every year. That's what we have to stop doing.
I know you hate bumper sticker phrases about eras.
No, I don't.
Well, you said so in your book. You maybe not hate. You don't.
We call it the subtitle of the book is the age of global warming. So
we're past post-Cold War era then.
Yeah.
You think we're into something else?
Yeah, I suppose. To pick up on an earlier part of our conversation, Marcia, we're in the era, to put it positively. Well, we'll start with negative. Put it negatively, we're in an era of existential threats. Nuclear proliferation, climate change. But to put it positively, we're in the era of great opportunities for better global governance. Not world government, global governance.
Well, on that note, an optimistic note, we'll conclude. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it very much, Marcia.
You've been listening to Strobe Talbott, author and president of the Brookings Institution. Our conversation was held at the Sun Valley Writers Conference, and I'd like to thank Mr. Talbott and the organizers of that conference for finding time in his schedule for our visit. If you missed a portion of this program, want to watch it again, or want to check out the interviews I've conducted over the years at the conference, please go to our website. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thank you.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. To order a copy of this program from Idaho Public Television, call our toll-free number or visit us on the World Wide Web.